G'day everyone and welcome to week 6 of LA 3006 Administrative Law. This week we're going to look at all the grounds for review that we haven't covered so far. Hopefully you'll remember that these grounds for review are set out principally in Section 5 of the ADJR Act. So for these errors, we're assuming that the decision-making power exists under the enactment, we're assuming that the right person is making the decision, and we're assuming that any preconditions, whether procedural or otherwise, any preconditions for making the decision have been met. The rules we'll be looking at this week consider whether that decision maker is making their decision properly. Now, 2 warnings before we get started. First, I'm not going to be following the order in the ADJR Act. Instead, I'm going to group the different grounds for review together into little categories that make sense to me, because the list in the legislation really isn't in any helpful order. Second, this week has no less than 5 videos. Now that sounds like heaps, but there's a lot of material and I want to break it into bite-sized chunks. I promise it'll be worth it. In this first video, we're going to look at a ground for review called error of law. That's where the decision maker misunderstands the law that they're applying. In the second video, we'll look at some of the grounds for review that focus on the evidence and whether the evidence is considered properly. In the third video, we're going to look at the grounds for review where the suggestion is that the decision maker has behaved improperly. In the fourth video, we're going to look at a special type of administrative decision called a discretionary decision and the things that can go wrong there. In the final video, we're going to look at the 2 remaining grounds, which are called Wednesbury unreasonableness and uncertainty. So let's get started. Section 5(1)(f) of the ADJR Act says that a person can have an administrative decision reviewed if the decision involved an error of law, whether or not the error appears on the record of the decision. Errors of law mostly focus on situations where a decision maker asks themselves the wrong question. Ever since the start of your degree, you've been taught to ask yourself, what is the test and what are the elements? It makes sense that if a decision maker doesn't get those questions right, they may end up making a completely off-kilter decision. Now, the authorities on this question are 2 cases, a High Court case called Craig and South Australia and a British case called Annis Minnick and the Foreign Compensation Commission. But those cases are actually not super helpful on this point, so I'm going to make up an example. Let's stick with the scenario that we've been using right through this course, the idea of a learner driver and their logbook. Now let's imagine that the rules for the logbook included the following. This is made up, it's not in the actual regulation, but let's pretend there was a regulation that said the chief executive can only approve logbooks which were maintained on a smartphone app approved for that purpose unless extraordinary circumstances exist. So what's the test there? Extraordinary circumstances. If you can show extraordinary circumstances, well then you should be able to keep another logbook. Now let's imagine that our learner driver kept their logbook on paper because their family is in poverty and they're unable to afford a smartphone capable of running the app. So they apply to have their paper logbook recognised. The chief executive or their delegate is supposed to ask, are these extraordinary circumstances? Now let's say they just invent a rule that poverty can't be an extraordinary circumstance. Can you see that by inventing this rule they've actually changed the test? If they went ahead and made the decision based on the wrong test, then they'd make an invalid decision. So they'd respond to our learner driver by saying, we do not approve your logbook because extraordinary circumstances cannot include economic circumstances. The learner driver comes to you as a lawyer and your answer would be that the decision is invalid because it involves an error of law. The error of law is that the decision maker has not applied the proper test. So they haven't actually made the decision that they were supposed to make. Now, the next thing you might have noticed in the ADJR provision was that it said that a decision is reviewable if it involves an error of law, whether or not the error appears on the record of the decision. What's that all about? Well, under the common law, an error of law could only be appealed if the actual decision document showed the error of law. If the decision document didn't show the error of law, it couldn't be appealed. What does that mean? Well, let's stick with the same made-up example. Let's say the delegate comes back to our learner driver with a decision which says, we do not approve your paper logbook because we do not hold the view that extraordinary circumstances exist in your case. Can you see how, if you just read those words, there's no error of law evident from the actual words? Now let's imagine the decision said, we do not approve your paper logbook because your circumstances related to economic poverty, and economic poverty cannot be an extraordinary circumstance. It's the same decision, but this time the error is clear on the face of the document. See the distinction? Now that I've taught you about that distinction, though, you can forget it, because the ADJR Act makes it clear that an error of law can be appealed, whether or not it's apparent on the face of the document. If there's an error of law, the decision can be reviewed. So that's the first video of the 5 we're going to work through this week. In this video, we've looked at the idea of an error of law, where the decision maker misunderstands the law, misunderstands the question that they're required to ask. We now know that decisions can be reviewed if they're based on an error of law, regardless of whether the error appears on the face of the decision or not. Next, we're going to look at the grounds of review that focus on evidence. See you in video 2.